The Pima County Adult Probation Learn Lab is a GED study program open to all legal residents 18 and over. Serving the Tucson area with 3 sites, we offer small classes, individual instruction, and college and career advice to help guide you on your path to a greater future. To learn more, visit our website and click on the Contact Us button.
Welcome to Part 2 of the TABE Mastery Level e-reading series. The following are the objectives for today's lesson. Identify the main idea of a passage, restate the key details in your own words, explain how key details support the main idea, distinguish between key details and minor details, and summarize elements of the situation leading up to the December 7, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, such as relations with Japan, why the attack was a surprise, and what the command staff did or did not do to prepare for an attack. This lesson meets the following ADE standards. Please press pause to read them in detail. In our last lesson, we talked about details which answer key questions like who, what, where, why, when, and how. Today, we're going to be talking about the main idea. Now, what is a main idea? What does a main idea mean to you?
Well, you just said that details tell me who, what, where, when, or why, so I'm guessing a main idea doesn't do that.
Well, more precisely, it's what you get when you put all those things together. It's usually the common thread among all those details. It's the big picture.
Does it bring everything together, all those details together in one?
That's exactly what it does, is it brings all those details together in one unifying idea. It is the most important idea in the passage that you are reading or writing. Most of this lesson will be focusing on the main idea in a paragraph. Now, what is a paragraph? A paragraph is a group of sentences that center around a main idea. The first line is indented or moved in about ½ an inch, and it continues until it has fully discussed this idea. Then a new paragraph is started on a new line, which is also indented. A new paragraph should have one main idea. A new idea will need a new paragraph. One idea per paragraph. The paragraph should have sentences providing details that support the main idea. Think of the main idea as this big triangular slab, the roof of your structure, and the details as the columns that are going to hold up your main idea. There's no set requirement on how many details you have here. You just need enough to do the job of supporting the main idea.
So it could be less, like even less than that?
It could be even fewer than that, yes. Now a big idea is going to need a lot of columns, whereas a little idea might only need one column or detail.
Could it ever be 0?
It could, but it would really just be like this structure with no columns to support it. You'd get a slab just sitting on the ground, which can happen, but don't let it happen very often. Usually, if the idea doesn't need any supporting details, it's probably just not even big enough to be mentioned. Now, the main ideas are not restricted to just paragraphs. Your book can have a main idea. There could actually be a couple of main ideas in that book, but if you read a book, somebody's going to ask what's it about. And I'm going to say my book is about bear attacks and why they happen and how to avoid them. This book is going to be divided into chapters which support its main idea. My diagram here has only 3 chapters, but books usually have a lot more in real life. Each chapter has its own main idea, which acts as a supporting detail for the main idea of the book. The chapters might be divided into sections, and each of these sections has its own main idea. The main ideas of the chapters are supported by the main ideas in the sections. The main ideas of the sections will be supported by the main ideas of their paragraphs. And the main ideas of the paragraphs are supported by the details of the sentences that make them up. So you can go into as much or as little detail as you want. Now, why am I talking about this? You will need these principles both in writing and reading for the GED. Here we're focused on reading. Whenever you're reading, you should be asking yourself, what is the main idea? How is it supported by these details? How do these details work together to support this main idea? Usually when you discover you're not really understanding what you're reading, it's because you are not seeing how these main ideas and details fit together. Looking for these connections should help you troubleshoot where you're having difficulties in understanding the passage.
And if you can read the book and know what the main idea is of the book and all the chapters, then those are right because it's in a book.
Well, that opens up another can of worms. Just because it's in a book doesn't mean it's correct. There are other considerations you're going to have to take to evaluate whether this book is believable or just full of malarkey.
So if it's written right there in the book, it could still be wrong?
Yeah, sometimes it is. The Bear Attacks book that I loved so much was written by someone who is recognized as one of the foremost authorities on bears. But just because someone wrote a book doesn't mean they're not a crackpot.
So how can I know if they're both written in book?
Unfortunately, there's no quick answer to that, so that'll have to be a question for another session. It actually doesn't matter whether the writer is correct. You just need to be able to figure out what their main idea is. Whether or not you agree with their claim is actually totally irrelevant.
So even if they're wrong, they could have a main idea?
Yeah, it might be a really stupid idea, but they still have a main idea. It may be poorly supported. The better the supports, the more likely you can believe the main idea. If the supports have a lot of cracks in them, they're not going to hold up the main idea very well, and it could end up crashing down. Now, telling a good argument from a bad one is something that you will have to be able to do for the GED, but we're not going to focus on it in this lesson. Today, we're just going to focus on identifying the main idea and how it is supported. Once you really understand how to do that, you'll be better equipped to decide if you're reading a good book or a bad book. Now, I'll level with you. Identifying the main idea isn't my favorite activity because it's not as straightforward as, say, adding two numbers. I prefer things that are straightforward, but unfortunately, life isn't straightforward. Sometimes the main idea is really clear and easy to find. First place that you should look would be the first sentence or the last sentence. If you remember from the last lesson, we were talking about the attack on Pearl Harbor. One of the questions that came up was, why did this attack happen? Let's go ahead and read this next paragraph. Can I get a volunteer to read it, please?
I'll do it. In 1940, the growing threat of Japanese imperialism, President Franklin D. Roosevelt decided to step up U.S. military presence in Pearl Harbor. California had been a naval stronghold for the Pacific, but Pearl Harbor was in a much more strategic location. Nearly the entire Pacific fleet was moved from California to its new home in Pearl Harbor.
Okay, thank you. Now, there are a couple of words in here that you may or may not be familiar with. First, imperialism.
Oh, I know. My grandfather used to drive an Imperial.
Yeah. Do you think that's likely that the problem was that the Japanese are driving too many Imperial cars?
I mean, it's 1940. Grandpa's car was pretty old.
Were the Japanese even competing with us making cars at that point? Anyway, imperialism is talking about a country expanding beyond its own borders. So let's say you've got your own little country and it doesn't have enough resources like oil or gold, but you see across the ocean that country over there has a nice little supply, so you go over there and you take all their stuff and you take their country while you're at it. So you're claiming their country in the name of your country. That is imperialism.
That sounds like you're talking about building an empire?
Yes. Or think about the Empire in Star Wars, which was a political system that was taking over all the other planetary systems that were there. And nobody could be free or independent. They had to do what the Empire was saying. Okay, so let's look at the sentence again. With the growing threat of Japanese imperialism, what we're saying is that Japan is more and more trying to expand its influence over other countries and control them and their resources. With the growing threat of Japanese imperialism, the president decided to step up the military presence in Pearl Harbor. California had been the main location for the Navy in the Pacific, but Pearl Harbor was in a much more strategic location, a much better location for military plans. It was a lot closer to Japan, so the Navy would be able to respond more quickly if Japan got up to something. So nearly the entire Pacific Fleet was moved from California to its new home in Pearl Harbor. The most important idea of this paragraph is that the Navy would move over to Pearl Harbor. Now, I kind of see this idea in two places here. It's in the first sentence, Roosevelt decided to step up the military presence in Pearl Harbor. It's also in the last sentence, nearly the entire Pacific Fleet was moved from California to its new home. It's just kind of a difference in focus. In fact, I had an argument with a colleague where we really didn't quite agree. We saw the main idea in different places. One of us saw it in the first sentence, the other saw it in the last sentence, and I think there were really solid arguments for both positions. Finding the main idea is not always cut and dried.
I mean, on that conversation, it is a specifically taught principle of composition that one of the options you have is simply to restate your thesis. So maybe both are right.
That's quite possible, and this is really an introductory paragraph to the next section. We're just setting up the stage for what's happening. What I want to point out is, don't get discouraged if you're having trouble identifying the main idea. It does not mean you're doing something wrong. You could very well be doing something right. Now, it's not to say this is an impossible task, but it's not like math where it's either right or it's wrong. This is one of the difficulties in reading. It's that so much of it is a matter of interpretation. The way I'm looking at this paragraph is, the whole point was the president wanted to build up the military in Pearl Harbor. The other sentences are providing more information about why and how it was done. California had been a stronghold for the Pacific, but Pearl Harbor was a much more strategic location. That's why we're moving it out to Pearl Harbor. It's a better location. That's why we're doing it. How did we build up the military presence in Pearl Harbor? We just moved the whole fleet out there. So the last sentence is kind of the how.
It's interesting, in the introductory book, never once do they specify that Pearl Harbor is in Hawaii.
Okay, well, we talked about that in the last lesson. So remember, Pearl Harbor is in the middle of the Pacific. It's in Hawaii. I'll show you a map of that in a little while. All right, so our main idea, U.S. stepped up military in Hawaii. So you notice I didn't even write a complete sentence here. It's just a very quick note. What are the details that support it? Pearl Harbor was more strategic, and the fleet moved to Pearl Harbor. These details answer the questions why and how. And if you remember from the last lesson, the details answer exactly these kinds of questions. Now, what's interesting is that sometimes ideas will feed the next idea. So the main idea of one paragraph should feed into the main idea of the next paragraph. I often find when I'm reading, I'm not paying attention. I just look at this paragraph, blah, blah, blah. Okay, it says this, whatever. I move on to the next paragraph, blah, blah, blah. It says this, and I never really connect how they fit together. So I have failed to really understand that passage. I didn't really learn anything, and it's only after I've read it 2 or 3 times that I finally start to see how all these ideas connect to each other. That's when I know that I understood what I read. So if we look at the next paragraph, we see what happened when we moved the Navy over to Pearl Harbor. The Empire of Japan saw this move as a threat. The U.S. military was nearer than it had ever been to Japan. The empire sought to expand its global presence and power. The United States was now close enough to meddle with Japan's quest to expand into mainland Asia. Meddle just means bother or interfere. The United States is now close enough to mess with Japan's attempt to take over Asia.
Is mainland a country? Where's that place?
Okay, so let me draw a rudimentary map, a really, really rough map. Here's most of Asia, or the east part of Asia. Japan is this little island right off the coast of Asia. The United States is over here, and this all is the Pacific Ocean between them. All right, now, as I said, Japan is this island here. Mainland means the main part of the land, so it is that big continent. All of this, Japan and the mainland together, that is all considered Asia. So mainland Asia is the part of Asia that makes up this continent. Japan is trying to take over mainland Asia, and the United States is now close enough to be able to interfere. Okay, so back to the paragraph. What's the main idea here? The Empire of Japan saw this move as a threat. The rest of the sentences explain why it was a threat. Let's look down here at this diagram. The roof of the building, the main idea, is that Japan felt threatened by the U.S. move to Hawaii. Not only should the paragraphs feed into each other, but also the details, the individual sentences, will feed into each other. First we have the U.S. military was a lot closer to Japan, combined with the fact that the Empire of Japan's trying to expand into the world. You put these two sentences together and we get the U.S. is now close enough to interfere with these plans, and all of that feeds into why did Japan feel threatened by this move. Now for the catch. Usually the main idea is not stated outright in the paragraph. When you're taking your GED exam, they'll probably give you a paragraph that you have to read and then say what the main idea is. You'll have 4 choices for the main idea, and not one of those choices is actually stated in the paragraph. You'll have to read the whole paragraph and make some logical judgments about which of the 4 choices best captures the main idea. Life is not fair. If life were fair, we would only have the math exam, and the only reading we'd have to do would be Harry Potter. What you're going to have to do is start looking for clues. Things to check would be the title of the passage, if there is one. That will give you a big hint into what it's about. Okay, also, ask yourself who or what the text is about. You can look for repeated words, and most importantly, look at all the key details to find a common thread. This last one, look at the key details, that is really going to be your go-to when you're finding the main idea. What these key details all say together will be the main idea. So let's start working on this with the next paragraph. For years, Japan had imperial ambitions to expand to China and other parts of Southeast Asia. When Japan decided to declare war on China in 1937, America responded with trade embargoes and economic sanctions. Specifically, the oil embargo that America organized was a thorn in the side for Japan, which imported 90% of its oil. Without oil, Japan's military could not function, and all war efforts would come to an end. Negotiations had been going on for months between Washington and Tokyo without any resolution. War seemed inevitable.
You didn't finish. War seemed inevitable. 1.
Okay, yeah, that 1 is called a footnote, and it refers down to the bottom of the page. It just shows you where I got this from, because when you take somebody else's work, you need to say where you got it. Now, why is that? This is slightly off topic, but it's worth mentioning, because if you go on into college, you will have to write research papers, and you'll have to use footnotes. You'll have to cite or state where you got your information from. One reason for this is you can't take credit for somebody else's ideas. You need to give credit to the person who came up with them. The other reason is you're going to be a lot more believable if your readers can retrace your work and see where you got the things that you are claiming. Your reader will want to know whether the source where you got your information from was a good book or a bad book. They'll also want to know whether you made the right conclusion when you used that information. Okay, so anyway, before we go on, let's look at some vocabulary that may be issues. So trade embargoes, that is just blocking trade ships. Japan, like every other country that has a coast, is trying to send ships out to do some trading, and American ships are stopping the Japanese ships from getting to their destinations. Economic sanctions are kind of the same thing. We are stopping their ability to trade. It's a form of punishment for a country. In fact, sanction is one of the few words that is an opposite of itself. You can sanction something, meaning you are allowing it, but you can also sanction something, which means that you are punishing it.
Raise. I raised a barn. What did I do? Did I destroy it or did I construct it?
I like the word dusting. We were in the Tower of Terror at Disney World. We were in this haunted hotel, and my mom commented that everything in there needed dusting. And one of the employees said, "Oh, I'll be sure to bring out more dust for that." Yeah, so anyway, that's an aside, but that's what makes words fun. All right, what else? The oil embargo that America organized was a thorn in the side for Japan. So I don't know if you've heard this expression, a thorn in the side, but think about it. Do you think it's fun to have a thorn stuck in your side?
My side or somebody else's?
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you think it's fun for the recipient to have a thorn stuck in their side? America might have enjoyed putting that thorn in Japan's side, but Japan was a little bit ticked off about that. Okay, let's see. What else? We have negotiations had been going on for months. So negotiations are just formal talks between the country's governments. All right, we've got this long paragraph, and there's a lot to sort through. Let's sift through the details and try to see what questions we can answer. The first question I want to look at is who. Who are the main players in this paragraph?
And they didn't think war seemed like a bad thing? Because you taught me before that in means not, so I see not, and I guess that means evil, not evil.
And whoops, I missed a word. Thank you. War seems inevitable. Okay, so here's the deal. Breaking up words into their pieces often does help you with decoding their meaning, but not always. If you don't know what evet means, which I don't, then you may just have to guess what the word means. Based on the fact that we've been talking about countries being unfriendly, a good guess would be unavoidable. Okay, so back to my question. Who are the main players in this particular paragraph?
Japan,
America.
China,
Yeah.
But we stopped talking about mainland Asia. Now we're talking about a place called Southeast Asia.
Yeah, these are all parts of Asia. China's a country that makes up a huge chunk of mainland Asia. It's practically across the street from them. It's in the southeast part of Asia, the continent where all these countries are located. So yeah, we have Japan, US, and China. So what it looks like is happening is that Japan has been bullying China, and US is coming along and saying, hey, don't do that, stop picking on China. For right or for wrong, that is what the US was doing.
I thought we didn't like China.
Yeah, well, you know how countries are. It's like, remember back in junior high when somebody's your best friend one day and they're your mortal enemy the next day? So right now we're not getting along with China, but 80 years ago we were trying to help them out. So here's an important question. Are these countries getting along during the time that this paragraph is talking about? Yeah, I don't think they're getting along at all. How long has this been going on?
For months? For months? I see it says for months.
Well, the negotiations have been going on for months, but look at the first two words of the paragraph. For years. And another thing, we see here in this paragraph that Japan decided to declare war on China in 1937. And we know from last time that the bombing of Pearl Harbor happened in 1941. So we're definitely talking about years here. Now, if you put all those together, what's the common thread? Here's what I came up with. The main gist of this paragraph is that the US and Japan have been increasingly unfriendly for years, and this built up to the probability of war. You don't have to use exactly those words, but you should have the same basic idea. Now, down here where we have the main idea up in that slab, I'm going to write it slightly differently, so here's another way you could say it. Tensions were building, war seems like it's going to happen. Like I said, there's no single one right way or a wrong way to word the main idea, but the gist should be the same. When you take the GED and they ask you which of these 4 sentences expresses the main idea, you're probably going to find that not one of them says it exactly the way you want to say it. So you'll have to decide which one is the closest to what you wanted to say.
So you have 2 different things that express the main idea. So on the test, is there like 2 or 3 right answers?
No. One of them is going to be better. You'll never get 2 choices that say essentially the same thing. Something important will be different about them. So here our main idea is tensions are building, war is going to happen. All these other sentences are supporting it. Japan attacks China. The US cuts off Japan's oil in response. Japan needs the oil. Talks between the US and Japan aren't going anywhere. All of these little pillars go to support the idea we're not getting along and we're not seeing a happy ending out of it, which is still another way of phrasing the main idea. Let's try another one. Japan understood that the US was a powerful nation. They knew they would not be able to defeat the US in a prolonged war. What does prolonged mean?
You are in favor of a long war.
Oh, another prefix that's a false friend. Pro can mean in favor, but here it just means a war that has been made longer. Their only chance is to cripple the US military by striking fast and hard. If they succeeded, the US, which had their own problems and wanted to avoid a war, would have to negotiate for peace. Japan would then be free to expand where they wanted and take the natural resources they needed without American interference. Okay, so what are some of the key details here?
So, America is powerful.
Okay, yes, America is powerful. What's another detail?
Japan needs oil.
Okay, well that's not in this paragraph. They do need oil, but that was from a preceding paragraph, so let's just look at what do we see here.
Japan has to strike fast and hard.
Good. What else do you see here? Why do they have to strike fast and hard?
Because America is powerful.
And what happens if they do?
Because if they would cripple us, we would be able to fight them, and then they could go ahead and do what they want.
Good. Okay, let's see what I was thinking when I wrote the answers to these questions. Okay, so yeah, I really should have listed the US as very powerful as its own detail, but I combined it with one of the other details that the US would be tough to get out of the way. They kind of reinforce each other. So I have Japan needed the US out of the way, the US was going to be tough to get out of the way, and a quick, strong attack was the best way to cripple the US. We can sum that up as, to continue their goals, Japan's going to have to strike the US military fast and hard. We see elements of this main idea in the sentences here, like fast and hard, but no one sentence captures it all. Now to help you picture things, we have these maps. This little bitty inset map here shows the US and Asia. Here's the United States, so the Navy used to be based somewhere around here. Notice Japan is over here. This area here is all mainland Asia. China's over here. Japan is attacking China. They're also attacking other places in Asia. Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor is over here, which is a lot closer to Japan than California. So that's the big picture. Now the larger map shows a close-up view of Pearl Harbor, so we're zooming in on this area over here. Now I don't want to spend too much time on this, but history is a part of the social studies section of the GED, so we're actually killing two birds with one stone. So imagine taking your battleship through this channel from the ocean into the harbor. Notice how this harbor is really sheltered. It's almost completely surrounded by land. It would be a great place to park your ships to keep them safe from storms, right? Now up to this point, wars on the ocean were conducted with battleships that had giant guns on them that could shoot at whatever was on the land. So if your enemy wants to attack you with big battleships out here in the ocean, it's going to be hard for them to get into this harbor. They would have to go in one at a time and would probably get destroyed on the way in by your ships, which are just sitting there waiting for them. And this is the only way in where your ships are. So the harbor seems like a really great place to put your navy. It's nice and protected. The problem is technology. The people making the plans did not keep up with technology. We now have aircraft carriers, which can get airplanes close enough to the target to attack from the air, so your enemy doesn't have to go through this narrow little channel. They can just attack from the air, boom, 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 and shoot all the boats that are down there. Whoops, sorry, ships. I understand military people think it's a capital offense to say boat instead of ship.
Only sailors. Soldiers and airmen don't care. We call them.
All right.
But there might be a naval person in the audience. We're in Arizona, so we probably have a very strong Navy here.
Well, Arizona has never been attacked by naval gunfire.
That is true. So now we have the airplanes flying in overhead and shooting at our ships. And what happens when our ships here try to escape? They're bottlenecked in the narrow channel. There's no way to get out to the sea, so this area that was supposed to be a nice, safe harbor turns out to be a death trap. Moral of the story, pay attention to technology. If you ignore it, you are going to get kicked.
I don't know. Certainly absolutely would have offered protection against weather. Zero doubt about that. But I would think that even with 1930s technology, I would think naval gunfire from a main battleship would have a range of multiple miles.
Okay.
It looks like less than a mile from the opening of that harbor to the. So I think if you literally had a battleship where you portrayed it, I think the fire could have bridged that distance. Of course, in both directions.
Yeah, but without a line of sight, it would have been a lot harder to aim.
You wouldn't have line of sight, that's true. And that would have been a big deal then.
So you still would have been protected from the battleships. The moral of the story is, evolve. Alright, let's look at this next guy here. As World War II raged elsewhere, few U.S. leaders thought an attack on Pearl Harbor was likely. An attack on American soil seemed foolhardy given U.S. military strength as well as the enormous distance between Japan and the United States. Pearl Harbor and all its holdings seemed quite secure, until they weren't. Alright, first of all, before we go anywhere, what is this right here?
An error.
It's a crime against humanity. It is not a complete sentence. It is a fragment. Do not try this at home. The writer is trying to use nice, friendly, approachable language. When we talk in real life, we use fragments and run-on sentences all the time. That's what the writer is imitating here. But don't do it in your own writing or you will get crushed by your teachers. Whether you're an artist or a writer, before you can take liberties with the rules, you have to understand the rules backwards and forwards. And part of understanding the rules is understanding when it's okay to bend them and when it's not. I see the book where I got this passage as being a little too formal for it to be okay to break the rules and use a fragment, but clearly the writer and the editor disagreed. Moving beyond that, what do you think the main idea is here? If you need to read this again, hit pause and do so.
They thought Pearl Harbor would never be attacked.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I think. In fact, I'd say the first sentence really encompasses the whole main idea. Nobody thought Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked. The rest of the sentences just provide detail on why. The U.S. military was strong and Japan was far away from the United States. Pearl Harbor just feels really, really secure and nobody's going to attack. And that attitude is why the attack was such a surprise. Now, there's one more issue that I need to bring up for this lesson, and that goes back to details. We can have two kinds of details in our paragraphs: key details and minor details. So far we've been talking about the key details. These are the details you cannot live without in order to support or explain the main idea. They are the columns of our structure. If you take them away, the whole main idea is going to come crashing down. Minor details supply extra information that's nice to have, but it wouldn't affect the main idea if you took them away. Think of them as decorations that are on the pillars. They make the pillars a little bit nicer to look at, but if you didn't have them, it really wouldn't be all that crucial. As I said before, they provide extra information that's nice to have, but they don't actually provide any support for the main idea. One of the things that you'll be required to do for the GED is be able to tell which details are key and which are minor.
But, so you're saying I don't even need the minor details?
Well, you don't need them, but you might want them.
I don't even like reading. Why would they put things there that I don't even need?
It just makes it more interesting. I have more information. I can visualize it a little bit easier, see it better.
The minor details fill out the picture a little more. From now on, I'm going to be using the diagram here to show details instead of the one with the columns. The main details, the key details, these are what really support the main idea, remember. You have to have them. You notice I've got 3 here, but remember there is no absolute set number. You have enough key details when your main idea is supported. These key details may be further explained by minor details, and again, there's no set number. We might have just one minor detail, We might have a couple of minor details or even more, or we might not even have any at all. So let's look at an example of how this works. Why did the attack surprise the Americans so much? Washington, D.C. knew that the situation with Japan was getting worse and sent a war warning to the American commanders in the Pacific. Admiral Kimmel and General Short were in charge of defending Hawaii. They were told that negotiations with Japan had broken down and an attack was expected on the Philippines, Malaya, Thailand, or Borneo within the next few days. Although both commanders were ordered to execute appropriate defensive deployment, there was nothing to indicate that Pearl Harbor was a target. Appropriate defensive deployment just means go to yellow alert, not red alert. And if you don't know what that means, go watch Star Trek.
Is that my homework?
Yes, that is your homework.
You know, I still think that paragraph contradicts itself.
Why do you think that?
There's nothing to indicate Pearl Harbor was a target. You're ordered to take appropriate defensive measures. If you're telling me I need to defend myself, that is an indication that I might be a target. You can't say there's no indication that Pearl Harbor was a target after you tell them you need to beef up your defenses. You know, if you tell me you better put on your flak jacket, I can't say, well, there was nothing to indicate I'd get shot at.
Yeah, that's true. I'd say, having grown up in Florida, I'd say this is the difference between a hurricane watch and a hurricane warning. These guys are under a hurricane watch, but that would mean, okay, keep an eye out, but we don't really think it's going to hit.
I'm a former Floridian too. In fact, I lived in Miami, and a hurricane watch still means maybe a hurricane is coming.
You clearly didn't live in Florida long enough. Anyway, let's summarize the details. This time, you see, I didn't even bother to cover up the details. Okay, so here I just restated the sentences in my own words. Washington sent a warning to the Pacific. Kimmel and Short were in charge of protecting Hawaii. The message is that things are bad with Japan and some of the islands in the Pacific are expecting an attack. It didn't really say anything specific about an attack in Hawaii. Which of these details are important, and are there any details in here that don't seem all that important?
Kimmel and Short are not important, but I think they're the ingredients to one of the dog food brands out there.
Thank you for saying what everyone was thinking anyway. But seriously, we don't really need to know who was in charge of defending Hawaii in order to understand why they're unprepared. It's just nice to attach names to the people who are in charge. Now, I'd say it's definitely important that Washington did send a warning to Pacific, and it's significant that the message says things are bad, we don't know what's going to happen, but probably something. And it's important that the message said, get ready for that something.
I'm seeing it again. I mean, again, I think that the third and the fourth sentences are completely contradictory with each other. If you send me a message that says, there's danger in Pacific Islands, and I'm in Hawaii, which is an island in the Pacific, you don't have to say Hawaii for me to go, oh, I've got a problem.
I do agree, but it's also possible that some of this is Monday morning quarterbacking. I wasn't there, so I obviously don't know. I would interpret the message as stuff could be about to happen in the islands that are much closer to Japan, the islands that Japan has been eyeballing lately, and we put the naval base out there for a reason. I see this as get ready to jump into the fray in response to an attack on Borneo, which is not the same thing as expect an attack on your own base. But I think your point is valid, and many people have argued over the years about how much did the government know and when. If you believe the movie Tora, 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 which admittedly is pretty much the extent of my knowledge on this subject, which was a fairly accurate movie, I believe, you'd conclude that America's unpreparedness was less of an intelligence failure and more of a communications failure. People did know something was up, but they failed to communicate that adequately in time. You look like you're about to choke.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm thinking of Tora, 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 and I mean, I guess you're right. I mean, when they make the call from the radar site and they say, hey, we've got this massive formation coming in.
Don't worry about it.
Right, don't worry about it. but it is hard to see things that are outside of your paradigm. So if you just fundamentally don't believe in extraterrestrial life, it's very difficult to convey. We see these things moving in, you're going to say, well, it must be asteroids passing by, because it's not in your worldview to accept the thing that's being communicated to you.
Right, but what I think was a bigger communications failure was that it looked like back in Washington, D.C., they had already concluded, based on all the messages that they had decoded, that Japan was about to declare war on the U.S., and they were getting ready to send an alert to Hawaii, but there was a communications channel breakdown. Remember, the guy who was supposed to send the message out didn't seem to really be taking it seriously, and then there was interference in the atmosphere, so then they had to try to find some other way to send it.
What did try the Navy? What makes you think their atmosphere are better than ours?
For those of you at home, you really need to just stop what you're doing and watch Tora.
Before or after I watch Star Trek? You're giving me so many assignments.
Okay, so we got a little bit off topic here, but what you see is us responding to the text and arguing about it. And when you find yourself doing that, it's a good indication that you've understood what you were reading. How can we express the common thread of these key details? Okay, well, I wrote it as Pearl Harbor had been warned that something was up somewhere, but not in Hawaii. And the details that support this: Washington, D.C. knew the situation with Japan is getting worse. They were told, they being Hawaii, that negotiations with Japan had broken down. And then finally, although both commanders were ordered to execute this appropriate defensive deployment, there was nothing to indicate specifically that it was going to be at Pearl Harbor. And then I have as a minor detail, Kimmel and Short were those American commanders. Again, it's nice to know who is in charge, but it doesn't actually tell us why Pearl Harbor was surprised. Okay, let's do one more example. Short took no action except to move his aircraft together in the middle of the base to prevent sabotage. That was dumb. Kimmel ordered a partial alert but failed to establish sustained round-the-compass aerial patrols. Aerial just means in the air, so in other words, patrols with airplanes. Down here you can see a compass. Around the compass is kind of like around the clock, except that instead of meaning it's happening at all hours of the clock, it means patrols are going around in all directions on the compass. He considered sending the battle fleet out to sea, but decided against it. The only 2 American carriers in the Pacific had been detached to deliver planes to the Marine garrisons on Midway and Wake Islands. Detached just means sent away, kind of the opposite of attached. Torpedo nets were also unavailable. The Navy Department was convinced torpedoes would be ineffective in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Okay, let's list the details. First one, Short did nothing except move the airplanes, and all he did was put them all together so that they would make a nice, convenient target for the Japanese airplanes.
I don't agree with you that he was dumb. Again, if your solid belief is a frontal assault on Pearl Harbor is pretty much out of the question, then the next greatest danger is sabotage.
But this goes back to your mindset needing to evolve with the technology. There'd been plenty of air raids in Europe, but it's only about 650 miles from Germany to England, and because Germany occupied most of Europe, they didn't even have to take off from Germany. Japan, on the other hand, is over 4,000 miles from Hawaii, so attacks were considered far more likely to come from battleships. In fact, even some of the Japanese commanders, including the one leading this attack, were skeptical about using aircraft carriers to bring the bombers to attack a target that was so far from Japan. The logic at the time was, well, the way things have always been done so far, the big gunboats can't get to us. The biggest threats are going to be from Japanese agents on our island engaging in sabotage, so let's gather all the planes together in one spot where we can guard them more easily. But again, because of the advance in technology, what they thought was the safest precaution turned out to be the worst thing they could possibly do. Another detail from the text, Kimmel did little but no real patrolling. He also decided not to send the fleet out to sea away from Pearl. The only 2 carriers that they had were not at Pearl Harbor. There were no torpedo nets, and finally, no one thought torpedoes were a threat. Now we need to decide which ideas are really important and which are not, and then we need to figure out what the common thread is for the important details. This one took me a bit of pondering, but I ended up separating the details into 3 categories. So the first category is what did General Short do? Then there's what did Admiral Kimmel do? And then there's that little bit extra about the torpedo nets, which it said was the Navy Department's responsibility.
The torpedo nets is a little bit chicken and egg. I mean, there were no nets because no one,
Nobody had been attacked by
right.
torpedoes.
So is the no nets the point, and no one thought torpedoes were a threat, is the support to no nets,
Right.
or is no torpedoes are not a threat is the point, and no torpedo nets is support to that?
That's true, but this passage is talking about the lack of protection, the things that they didn't do, and they didn't have the nets either. Why? Because no one thought they were needed. Now, in case people are wondering what we're talking about, here are some photos of torpedoes. As you can see, they can be shot off of a boat or dropped from an airplane, and then they land in the water and zoom through the water and get their target.
So they're like a missile.
The thing is that the torpedoes are supposed to sink fairly deeply before they zoom off after a target, and it was thought that the water in Pearl Harbor was way too shallow for that. The torpedoes would just hit the bottom of the harbor and stay there. Well, the Japanese thought of that, and they developed a torpedo that wouldn't sink very deep, so it could go on and do its job. Again, the Americans didn't keep up with technology. Now, torpedo nets are something I'd never heard of, which actually isn't that surprising because there are lots of things I've never heard of, but here's what they look like. They were used to stop torpedoes, and sometimes they were even mounted on ships. Alright, so let's wrap this up. We have what Short didn't do or did do. We have what Kimmel did, partial alert but nothing really big, and there are a couple of other things he also thought about doing but didn't really do. I would consider those things minor details that give a little extra filling for the key details. And then we finally have the torpedo nets were not there to help out, and why. Now it is your turn to practice. Open up your handy-dandy TABE Mastery Level E reading book, and please do pages 46 through 51. The control question for this assignment, which proves that you watched the whole video, is this. I gave 3 examples of mistakes the Americans made where they did not keep up with technology and which led to the Japanese launching a successful attack. Name one of these examples. Be sure to include this on your homework somewhere. Just write it somewhere on your homework, or you won't get credit for watching this long video. Take pictures of your completed work and email the photos to this address, pcaplearnlabs@sc.pima.gov. Or if you prefer, you can just bring them in and hand deliver your work to us. But remember, your homework mission is not finished until you bring it on home.
Land that plane on that deck, man.
Am I required to see Tora and Star Trek before I do that assignment?
No, because the assignment in the book doesn't actually have anything to do with Star Trek or Tora. So do the assignment first, and then reward yourself with watching TV.
Dismiss!